Performance-Enhancing Disabilities by Elton Gar. Coach Henderson sat behind the wide desk wearing his brown suit that was one size too large with a tie that he had pulled on so that it was now hanging loose around his neck. He hadn't shaved for 2 days, and the smell of thousands of cigarettes filled the room. He was chewing on a plastic pen. At least he was trying to quit smoking again, Ryan thought. But he wasn't focused on his coach's bad habits. He was trying to remain calm. It was never good news when Coach asked you to close the door.
"Ryan, we have a problem,"
Coach Henderson said. Ryan already knew the problem. It had started at the end of the last season, but until this moment, he had been convinced that the commissioner would fix it. Still, he had to hear what happened, so he asked,
"They're not going to ban the prosthetics, are they?"
"Well, here's the problem. According to the letter of the law, they can't. It's illegal to discriminate against someone based on a disability, and having a missing arm is clearly a disability."
How can it be a disability when it gives them a massive physical advantage?
Ryan asked. He had spent his entire life training to pitch, and 2 years ago, had been arguably the best pitcher in the world. Now, thanks to the advancement in prosthetics, he was in danger of losing his job. Once you replaced a man's arm with metal and computers, he could pitch every day with both more speed and precision than any human.
Honestly, I'm not sure it would matter if the government gave them an exception. People watch the majors to see the best, and it's clear that people with robot arms are the best. But the good news is that they've set some regulations. The prosthetics have to use basic human movements. So no one can build a cannon to shoot baseballs,
Coach Henderson said.
Well, that's something, I suppose,
Ryan said. Not that it would matter. Even if he could get by throwing screwballs and sliders, it wasn't just the other pitchers he had to deal with. Prosthetic arms and eyes made batters far more dangerous as well. And since teams wouldn't need more than 1 or 2 pitchers at most, there simply wasn't room for anyone who wasn't the best. His career was over.
"I've already spoken with the owner. He likes you and your name still draws people. So he's offered to pay for the surgery if you want to keep pitching."
He like me so wants me to have my arm cut off,
Ryan said.
"If you still have an arm, then it's not a prosthetic, and that would be cheating, and the arm would get in the way,"
the coach said.
I'll have to think about it,
Ryan said.
"I understand, but the season starts in 3 weeks, and we need a pitcher or we're going to lose a lot of games,"
the coach said. After drinking until he couldn't remember any of the dozen reasons why it was a bad idea to get his arm cut off, and spending another night looking over his finances to consider just how much money he owed, Ryan decided there really wasn't any decision to be made. He had to pitch for at least 2 more years just to keep from going bankrupt. The surgery itself wasn't as bad as he had expected. The owner flew him to Mexico and paid enough for the doctors to not ask any questions. They put him to sleep, and when he woke up, he was a one-armed man. Recovery didn't take long, and there wasn't much pain. The doctors had done a good job, and after spending a night drinking with Coach Henderson, he was almost excited. But while the nights could be fixed by having enough to drink, or taking a couple of painkillers and forgetting everything, his days were ruled by the fear that he had made a mistake. He had assumed he would get the artificial arm immediately. Once he began to do things with his new arm, he was certain everything would feel better. After all, the whole problem was that the prosthetics were better than human arms in a number of ways. But while they were in a hurry to get him back on the field first, he had to fly to the one hospital in the world where they could do the remaining surgeries. There he had 20 small chips implanted into the small stump that remained on his shoulder, so he could control the prosthetic once he was ready. A week before the season was supposed to start, they attached what they called a practice arm. It was a half-dozen wires attached to a few metal tubes and some gears. It looked like something someone had rigged together in their garage, but they assured him that the basics of the machinery were the same, and it looked cheap because it was. That way, if he damaged it, no one would care. That turned out to be important, because the first several times he tried to move the arm, it flailed wildly. The second time, he actually hit himself in the face hard enough to give himself a black eye. After that, they put padding on the arm to protect him from himself.
Don't worry. It's a bit tricky until it's adjusted right,
the doctor said, and he typed something into the computer that was connected to Ryan's arm. The season had started before he had enough control of the arm that he could pick up a baseball. But once he had the basic control, things moved quickly, and by the next day he could do most things he could before, though they took far longer. After that, the only thing that he missed was any real sense of touch. The engineers and doctors were working on that, but for now there was no real feedback, and not being able to feel the ball was frustrating. But there was no time to think about that. He needed to be on the field immediately, so the next day he was on the mound throwing the ball. He wore a different arm for that, of course. It had been designed specifically for pitching. The biggest difference to Ryan was the metal frame that went under his uniform, so that the stress of the pitching was spread out across his entire body. Once he began to throw the ball, he understood the advantages immediately. Pitching before took his entire body. His legs, body, and arms, even head, all had to be working together to make a good pitch. Without that, you simply couldn't get enough power to strike out someone who was truly good at hitting. With the new arm, he simply picked up the ball and thought about where he wanted that ball to go. The arm did the work. It was like wearing a pitching machine on your shoulder. The problem was that the only advantage he had over someone who had began pitching a week ago was that he knew how to read the batter. But Ryan knew there had to be more advantages, and he began to experiment almost immediately. He found that by twisting and turning his body, he could adjust the spin on the ball. He suspected with time that could help, but there wasn't time, and for now moving mostly just made the aim worse. What that meant was, so long as he did almost nothing, the ball would be thrown at 120 miles an hour with almost perfect accuracy, and learning to do that only took a couple of days. During those days, Ryan had to remind himself this was about earning money, not about the joy of the game. That was important, because he barely felt as if he were playing baseball. It was too impersonal. The art was gone. Ryan might be better at choosing the right pitches than someone off the street, but the truth was that a pitching machine would likely be as hard to hit. They simply didn't use one, because it was against the rules to have a machine pitch. Still, Ryan was convinced there was an edge to be found. A way his knowledge of pitching could help him gain an edge. And while they needed him on the field immediately, because they were losing games badly, Coach Henderson still encouraged him to experiment. After all, he could pitch as well as anyone else by standing on the mound. And the coach wanted an edge as much as Ryan did. One thing that Ryan suspected was that the accuracy of the pitchers was part of the problem. Before, when a batter knew what you were going to pitch, they still had to adjust for human error. But now when they predicted where a ball was, and swung with mechanical arms, they hit the ball solid every time. This had made home runs more common, and foul balls, pop-ups, and even base hits less common. But none of the other pitchers had spent a lifetime learning to pitch. He doubted any of them had ever thrown a knuckleball or a curve in their life. They were simply injured in the right way to be useful to the teams, and willing to do what it took to get artificial arms better than any insurance would pay for. The first thing Ryan focused on was learning to throw a curveball. But the arm wasn't designed with the same range of movement as a human arm. It was meant to do one thing perfectly. But with some discussion with a small team of mechanics and engineers, Ryan was able to throw a pitch no one would expect. And the next day, he got the chance to test it. The owner, who had spent several $1 million by now, was becoming impatient, and so was Ryan. And now that he had a way to do something new, he was beginning to enjoy the game again. The machine was vital, but that didn't eliminate the artist. Still, he didn't have any of the finesse he had with his own arm. All he had was a good trick, and the certainty he could get better. But even with the limited amount of practice, the game went better than anyone could have reasonably expected. Only about half the opposing team had been augmented for batting. The half that hadn't been augmented had no chance, and several didn't bother swinging. They were going to be losing their jobs as soon as other people learned the handful of skills they needed, and until then their job was to field what few balls remained on the field. The other half should have been far harder to strike out. They had eyes that could measure the speed and angle of the ball perfectly, and arms tied into that information, so the bat was always in the right place. Some of the better players had batting averages over 500. Ryan saved his tricks for those batters. The curveball was the most valuable. They might be able to adjust for spin and movement eventually, and they certainly could against slower pitchers, but the program wasn't set to calculate for a curveball at 120 miles an hour. So when the curve worked, those batters were worse off than if they were simply swinging blind, because swinging blind you might hit the ball at random. But all their precise calculations did against his curve was guarantee the bat was the one place the ball wouldn't be. In that first game, 2 people touched the ball, and those were both high foul balls that his catcher caught easily. It was a perfect game. Something Ryan had never achieved before and had never believed he would. Of course that wouldn't last. They would update the programs, and other skilled athletes would get prosthetics. Right now, the best athletes playing now were men who had played baseball in high school before joining the military, where they were injured enough to need new limbs. But somewhere there was a kid who had tragically lost an arm, learning to use a primitive version of what Ryan had, who would be the next Babe Ruth. The second night, the opposition got 1 hit. A home run in the 4th. Ryan thought he had the batter on the hook after setting up a pattern of balls and strikes. Then once he saw all the signs that the pattern had been found, he threw a pitch that should have been a ball according to that pattern. It turned out that Ryan was the one who had been played, and the ball went over the fence. Not that it mattered. Their pitcher had similar prosthetics to Ryan's, but without any of the skill. He could pitch about 3 miles an hour faster than Ryan, and almost no one without batting augmentations could hope to hit him. But there were enough players on Ryan's team with prosthetics to score 4 runs before the game ended. 4 games and 1 hit later, a handful of people in the jersey of Ryan's team began to boo him. There were only a couple at first, but with each game there were more boos. People wanted their team to win, of course, but they also wanted to see baseball. What Ryan was doing, striking out everyone every time, was taking all the excitement out of the game. But there wasn't anything that Ryan could do. He couldn't go back to the way he pitched before. His arm was gone, and if he started to pitch worse, it would be clear he was throwing games, which at best would look bad, and it could get him thrown out of the game. He would just have to win until the game caught up with him. A month after Ryan began to pitch again, Coach Henderson called him into his office again. When he closed the door, Ryan knew something was wrong. But the coach didn't speak until he walked around the old white desk and lit his cigarette. Ryan suspected he knew what this conversation was, so he sat down and closed his eyes, trying to remain calm. But the coach didn't say anything. He simply placed a newspaper on the desk. It was a front-page story about a high school boy who had tried to cut his own arm off so he could become a pitcher. He had survived, but the newspaper was blaming baseball, and Ryan was mentioned by name in the article. And while it was the most dramatic, there were other stories. There were colleges giving sports scholarships to any amputee without asking how they lost their limbs, and a surprising amount of car accidents in which people lost their right arm. Ryan had already read the article, and so he asked,
"What about the law?"
They changed it. It's still illegal to discriminate because of disability, but in a sport, so long as the rules apply to everyone, they can ban the prosthetics. The commissioner is going to make a statement in 2 days. I'm sorry, but they aren't allowing anything that has a computer or complex machinery. Baseball is going to be human only,
the coach said.
But I can't use a prosthetic without those, and pitch even half as well as I did before the surgery.
And we feel bad about that. But even if they didn't change the rules, we were going to have to pull you. Ticket sales and TV ratings are both down. No one wants to watch someone who can't be hit. But the owner said you can keep the arm. It's of no use to him anymore.
Author's note. While this is science fiction, it's not as far-fetched as most of the stories I write. There are already discussions about whether the Olympics should ban runners with artificial legs. A robotic throwing arm is considerably more complex, but I find it far more interesting. Track and field is only interesting if you're in it, related to someone in it, or if it's 1936 and you're running against the Nazis. That said, I'm certainly not an expert on baseball, so I can only hope that I fairly represented the skill it takes to pitch and hit a baseball. If you liked this, you can sign up for my newsletter and get a free story every week at www.ansci-fi.com. Alternatively, you can support me by signing up for my Patreon at www.patreon.com/Elton and get a free patron-exclusive story every week. Thanks. Elton Gar.